A farmer found a strange ball on his field. When he saw what was inside, he screamed and ran for his life. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning sun rose slowly over the rolling fields of the Green family farm, spreading its light across the waves of tall, golden corn that stretched to the horizon. Dew glistened on the leaves, and the air carried the faint hum of insects and the distant murmur of the highway miles away. Marcus Green stood on the porch of his small wooden house, coffee mug in hand, his dark, calloused fingers gripping the handle with quiet steadiness. He had lived here nearly his whole life. Every inch of this land had known the weight of his boots, the sound of his shovel, the rhythm of his breath. This was his father's land, and before that, his grandfather's. He had promised himself long ago that he would never sell it, no matter how hard times became. For Marcus, the fields were more than just work. They were memory. The scent of wet soil after rain reminded him of his father's laughter when he was a boy, standing barefoot in the mud, learning how to plant properly, to feel the ground rather than just touch it. Even now, decades later, those lessons stayed with him. His father's voice sometimes returned to him on the wind, soft but firm, as if reminding him of the old promise, "Take care of what takes care of you." And Marcus did. Through droughts, storms, and seasons of debt, he had refused to give up. He took one last sip of his coffee, set the mug down on the porch rail, and gazed out across the fields. The corn shimmered in the sunlight like an ocean of gold, the proud work of months of labor. He smiled faintly. It was almost time to harvest, and if the weather stayed good for a few more days, he might even make enough this year to pay down part of his loan. The thought was comforting but fragile, like the first breeze of autumn before the chill. He knew better than to trust luck. The old tractor coughed to life a few minutes later, belching a puff of dark smoke as Marcus guided it between the rows. The engine's growl was familiar, steady, and comforting in a way that only long repetition could make it. He worked in rhythm, row by row, his body moving with the patience of someone who had long accepted the weight of endless effort. Birds scattered as he approached, and dust rose behind him in soft clouds. The morning slipped away into afternoon, and though sweat ran down his temples and soaked the back of his shirt, Marcus felt the quiet satisfaction of a man doing what he was born to do. It was around midday when he noticed something unusual in the distance. At first, it looked like a patch of light reflecting off the ground, a trick of the sun perhaps. But as he drew closer, the reflection didn't fade. Instead, it grew clearer. Something round, pale, and smooth, lying between the rows like a misplaced boulder. He slowed the tractor and frowned, shielding his eyes with one hand. When he reached it, the tractor sputtered to a stop, and the engine went quiet. Marcus climbed down and walked toward the strange object. It was half buried in the soil, larger than a man's torso, and shaped like a sphere that had been slightly dented on one side. Its surface looked organic at first glance, like a giant, misshapen pumpkin, but the texture was wrong. Smooth and waxy to the touch, with streaks of brown and gray clinging to it. He brushed away a layer of dirt, revealing an odd sheen beneath, almost metallic. A faint chemical smell lingered in the air, sharp and unfamiliar. He crouched beside it, studying its surface. The thing didn't seem alive, but it didn't feel like ordinary trash either. He had seen all kinds of debris over the years, plastic containers, torn tarps, even pieces of metal blown in from construction sites miles away. But nothing like this. It seemed deliberate somehow, as though it had been placed there. He pressed his hand against it. It was cool, much cooler than the surrounding soil. The air around it even felt heavier, thicker. Marcus stood and looked around. No tire marks nearby, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been here but him. The edges of his field were bordered by a thin line of trees that separated his land from the neighboring property. Beyond those trees lay acres owned by another farmer, Richard Brown, a man whose name always seemed to surface when trouble passed through. Marcus thought briefly of him and then dismissed the thought. Richard had his own business. He wouldn't bother sneaking something onto another man's land. Still, something about the situation unsettled him. He decided to leave the sphere where it was for now. The harvest couldn't wait, and the sun was already sliding westward. He told himself it was probably just a tank or a drum that had rolled loose from some industrial site. He'd move it later, after the day's work. As the afternoon wore on, he kept one eye on it while he worked nearby. The sunlight shifted, and the object's color seemed to change with it, from yellowish to gray, then almost white. It reflected the sky faintly, like water under glass. Marcus felt the urge to touch it again, but resisted. He didn't like the way it looked now, almost as if it were breathing in the heat. By dusk, he was exhausted. The fields were alive with the songs of crickets, and the first bats had begun to circle above the treetops. He parked the tractor near the barn, wiped his hands on his jeans, and glanced back one last time toward the field. The strange ball sat motionless where he'd found it, half shadowed in the fading light. For a moment, it looked almost like part of the earth itself, as if it had grown there, but something deep in Marcus's chest twisted uneasily. He walked home slowly, his boots dragging through the dust. Inside, he washed his hands at the sink and noticed the faint smell of soil mixed with something metallic on his skin. He scrubbed harder than usual, trying to get rid of it. Dinner was simple. Bread, beans, a slice of ham, eaten in silence. He turned on the small radio that sat on the counter, letting the crackling voice of the local weather forecast fill the room. Clear skies for the next week. Good news, though it didn't calm the restlessness that had begun to stir inside him. Outside, the night had grown still. The air hung heavy with the scent of crops and the faint sweetness of hay. Marcus stepped onto the porch before bed, taking one last look at his land. From this distance, he could see the pale outline of the sphere glinting faintly in the moonlight. It stood out against the neat rows of corn like a wound on the earth's surface. He told himself not to think about it anymore. Tomorrow he would deal with it. He had work to do, and worrying never fixed anything. Yet, as he climbed into bed and turned off the lamp, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. That smooth, silent shape resting in the soil, waiting. The house creaked as it settled for the night, and somewhere outside, a coyote called from the woods. Marcus stared at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to the wind brush against the walls. He had lived long enough to know when something wasn't right. And though he couldn't say why, he felt it deep in his bones. That strange object didn't belong here. It wasn't just some forgotten piece of machinery or strayed debris. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to hum faintly in the back of his thoughts even after he'd closed his eyes. Before sleep took him, Marcus thought again of his father and the promise he had made, to protect the land, to stand by it as long as he lived. He would keep that promise. Whatever that thing was, it would be gone soon. He didn't yet know that its presence had already begun to change everything, that the soil beneath his feet was no longer his ally but a silent witness to what was coming. The night deepened. The stars hung bright over the southern sky, their light falling softly over the golden field and the lone dark shape within it. From a distance, the farm looked peaceful, untouched by worry. Only the faint shimmer of the strange sphere betrayed that something foreign had taken root in Marcus Green's world, something that would not stay silent for long. The next morning rose heavy and gray, a thin mist clinging to the edges of the field like a veil. Marcus woke early, before the sun had fully broken through the clouds, his back aching from yesterday's labor. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, but beneath it was something else, something he couldn't quite place, a sharpness that didn't belong there. He sat for a long time on the edge of his bed, rubbing his palms together and listening to the silence of the house. The only sound was the slow ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen and the soft breath of the wind outside. He made his coffee as usual, poured it into the same chipped mug, and stood by the window. The field stretched out before him, muted by the mist. The stalks of corn were still, motionless, their golden color dulled by the morning haze. At first, everything looked ordinary, but then his gaze caught on a narrow, darkened patch cutting through the rows, a line that traced the path where he had rolled that strange ball the day before. The plants along it seemed slightly wilted, the leaves hanging heavier than the rest. Marcus set his mug down slowly and frowned. It could have been the rain, or maybe just the light. He tried to convince himself of that, but the unease from last night began to stir again. Pulling on his boots, he stepped outside and started toward the field. The grass was wet against his jeans, and as he walked, the smell grew stronger, not the sweet scent of soil or the sharpness of fertilizer, but something more chemical, biting, almost metallic. When he reached the first row, he knelt and touched one of the withered leaves. It crumbled easily between his fingers. The edges were burnt-looking, as though touched by fire, but the soil beneath was damp and cold. His heart sank a little. He followed the trail deeper into the field, and the further he went, the worse it became. The discoloration spread in a crooked line across several rows, leading directly back to the place where that ball had been half buried yesterday. The sphere still sat there, glinting faintly under the dull sky. Dew had gathered on its surface, making it shine as if it had been polished overnight. Marcus stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what he was looking at. He had worked this land for 30 years. He knew every rock, every shadow, every sound it made. But this thing, it was foreign, unnatural, as though it had fallen from a place that had nothing to do with soil or sun. He took a cautious step closer. The chemical smell was stronger here, enough to sting the inside of his nose. He reached out and touched the surface again, this time through the sleeve of his shirt. It was slick and damp, but the chill of it seeped through the fabric. He jerked his hand back, uneasy. Then he decided he couldn't leave it there any longer. Whatever it was, it didn't belong on his field. He fetched an old pair of gloves from the shed, the thick leather ones he used when handling barbed wire, and came back with a small crowbar. Kneeling beside the object, he tried to lever it up from the dirt. It didn't move at first, then gave a little under his weight, rocking slightly. He dug around it with his boot, loosening the soil, and after several tries managed to get it rolling. The ball was heavy, far heavier than it looked, but once it started to move, it seemed to glide more easily than he expected, as if the ground itself wanted it gone. Marcus grunted with effort, rolling it slowly toward the edge of the field. The sound it made was low and hollow, like something knocking from inside. Each time it turned, a faint squeak or creak followed, and the smell grew more intense. He tried not to breathe too deeply. The plants along its path bent and broke under the weight, leaving behind crushed stems and patches of darkened soil. By the time he reached the far end of the field, near the narrow dirt road that bordered his property, sweat was dripping from his chin. He pushed the ball down a small slope where the ground leveled out in a patch of wild grass near the tree line. There, it finally came to rest, half hidden among the weeds. He stood for a moment, catching his breath, hands on his knees, staring down at the object that had already caused him more trouble than he cared to admit. "Stay there," he muttered under his breath as though speaking to a stray animal. Then he turned and walked back toward his crops. For the rest of the day, Marcus threw himself into work, trying to drive the image of that thing from his mind. He cleared away broken stalks, checked the irrigation, and tended to the parts of the field that still looked healthy. Yet, no matter what he did, the faint, acrid smell lingered in the air. When the wind shifted, it carried that scent back toward him, like a reminder. By late afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, burning away the mist and revealing the damage more clearly. The narrow line of wilted plants stretched across his field like a scar. He knelt again, digging his fingers into the soil. The dirt was unusually soft, almost greasy, and when he pulled his hand out, a faint residue clung to his skin. He wiped it on his pants, but the irritation didn't go away. A slow itching began to crawl across his palms. He worked until dusk, ignoring the discomfort until the last of the light faded from the horizon. When he finally returned to the house, his hands burned. He washed them under cold water, watching the clear stream darken as the dirt and sweat ran off. The itching lessened a little, but a faint red rash remained along the base of his fingers. He rubbed lotion into his skin, grimacing at the sting, and told himself it was just an allergic reaction. Dinner was silent again. The radio hummed low in the background, playing an old blues song that reminded him of his youth. Outside, the night was calm, but the wind carried that same chemical note, faint but persistent. Marcus shut the window, trying to block it out. The next morning dawned bright and cloudless, a perfect day for work, yet something felt wrong before he even stepped outside. The air inside the house was thick, heavy with a faint odor that seemed to have seeped in through the cracks. When he opened the door and looked toward the field, his stomach dropped. From the porch, he could already see that the damage had worsened. The section nearest to where the sphere had rested now looked entirely dead. The plants were grayish-brown, their leaves shriveled and curling inward. Even the soil looked different, darker, almost black in patches. He set his mug down hard enough that it splashed coffee across the railing. He crossed the yard quickly, his boots kicking up dust. As he walked among the rows, the full extent of it became clear. What yesterday had been a narrow trail of decay was now spreading outward, consuming entire rows of crops. He knelt and scooped up a handful of dirt. It was dry, powdery, lifeless. When he let it fall through his fingers, it scattered like ash. A chill passed through him that had nothing to do with the wind. He straightened, turning in a slow circle, taking in the sight of the dying field around him. His life's work, the fruit of months of sweat and long, back-breaking days, was withering before his eyes. It felt personal, as if the land itself had turned against him. Marcus spent the next several hours trying to contain the damage. He pulled up the dead plants, carried them to a pile at the edge of the field, and burned them. The smoke rose in thin, gray ribbons that drifted over the road. The smell was sharp and bitter, making his eyes water. When he looked down again, the ash from the burning seemed to sink into the soil, disappearing instantly. By afternoon, his muscles ached and his throat felt dry. He sat for a moment on an overturned bucket, staring at the line of trees where the ball now rested beyond sight. A thought came unbidden, quiet but insistent. It started there. He had rolled the thing through his land, and wherever it touched, the ground died. He stood and began walking toward the edge of the property. As he moved, he could trace the entire path, a perfect line of destruction that led directly from the dead center of his field to the place where he had left the sphere. Each step confirmed what his mind already feared. It wasn't coincidence or disease. It was deliberate, mechanical, spreading like a stain. When he reached the slope, he stopped. The weeds that had surrounded the sphere yesterday were gone, reduced to a brittle crust. The ground itself was cracking, as though something beneath it had sucked the life out of the soil. The sphere looked unchanged, though. Its surface was clean, untouched by dust or debris, as if it existed separately from everything around it. Marcus felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He turned and walked back to the house, his boots crunching on the hard, dead ground. By the time he reached the porch, the itching in his hands had returned, worse than before. He washed them again, scrubbing until his skin was raw, but the burn wouldn't fade. He pressed a damp towel against them and sat by the kitchen window, staring out at his field. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in red and orange streaks. In that dying light, the field looked like an open wound, dark veins running through gold. The weight of it settled on his chest, not just the loss, but the uncertainty, the fear of what he didn't yet understand. He couldn't let this continue. Tomorrow, he decided he would take action. He would dig deeper, find out what that thing was and what it was doing to his land. He would get answers, no matter what it took. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Marcus sat in silence, his hands wrapped in cold cloth, his mind turning over the same thought again and again. The ball had poisoned his field, but how? And why here, on his land of all places? Outside, the night grew still. Somewhere near the tree line, a coyote's cry broke the silence, long and mournful. Marcus didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness beyond the field, where he knew that thing waited, silent and unmoving, as if it were listening. He didn't know it yet, but by morning the damage would be far worse, and his quiet life would no longer be his own. By the time the first light of dawn touched the fields again, the farm no longer looked like the home Marcus had always known. What had once been a living ocean of gold and green now seemed drained of its spirit. The air was unnaturally still, the silence heavy, as if even the insects had fled. Marcus stood on the porch before sunrise, coffee forgotten in his hand, staring at the expanse of deadened plants that stretched across the middle of his land. Overnight, the destruction had spread twice as far. The dark streaks he had seen yesterday had grown into a patchwork of decay, reaching into parts of the field that had been untouched the evening before. He walked out barefoot into the damp grass, the ground cold against his soles. The smell hit him first, stronger than ever, acrid and chemical, so powerful that it seemed to burn in his nose. He gagged slightly and covered his mouth with the back of his hand. Even the dew tasted metallic when it touched his lips. As he neared the center of the field, he realized the soil was changing color. It was darker, almost black, with streaks of gray like ash. It wasn't just dead, it was poisoned. Kneeling, he scooped up a handful and let it crumble through his fingers. The texture was wrong, sticky in places where it should have been dry, and when the early light struck the grains, he saw a faint shimmer, tiny, reflective particles mixed into the dirt. He had never seen anything like it. It looked artificial, as though someone had poured ground glass or metal dust into the earth. He rubbed his fingers together, and the itching that had plagued his skin for days flared up again, sharp and hot. He swore under his breath, wiping his hand on his pants, then immediately regretted it as the irritation spread. He knew this was beyond anything he could fix alone. For the first time since his father's death, he felt small and powerless on his own land. The earth that had once been his strength was turning against him, rejecting every seed, every root, every trace of life he had tended with such care. His mind raced through possibilities, disease, pollution, an accident, but nothing fit. The pattern was too exact, too deliberate, a straight path that traced the route of that sphere as if the object had poisoned the soil wherever it rolled. He had sent samples of soil and plants to the agricultural lab the day before, but he didn't expect much. In this part of the county, small farmers like him were forgotten by everyone except the tax office and the bank. Still, he needed answers. By mid-morning, he drove into town, his truck rattling along the old county road. The town was small, a gas station, a hardware store, a diner, and the dusty white building that housed the agricultural office. Inside, the air smelled of paper and disinfectant. A tired clerk in glasses handed him a sealed envelope, barely looking up from her desk. "Your results came back early," she said, pushing it across the counter. Marcus nodded, thanked her, and stepped outside before opening it. He stood under the awning, the sun rising behind him, and unfolded the printed report. He read it slowly, the words sinking in one by one. Toxic concentration of synthetic pesticides and industrial solvents. Origin undetermined. Presence of prohibited compounds inconsistent with agricultural use. His stomach turned. These weren't chemicals any ordinary farmer could buy. Some of the names he recognized from old news reports, substances banned decades ago after being linked to soil contamination and birth defects. The paper might as well have been written in fire. Whoever had put this stuff on his land hadn't just wanted to ruin a crop. They wanted to destroy everything. He folded the report carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and got into his truck. As he drove home, the anger inside him began to smolder. Every pothole, every shadow on the road seemed to whisper the same question. Who had done this, and why? The answer, he feared, was already forming in his mind. By the time he returned to the farm, the day was bright and merciless. Heat shimmered above the ground, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the air. He parked near the barn and sat for a long time with the engine off, staring through the windshield. The land looked worse in daylight. Patches of yellowed stalks lay flat, eaten by whatever poison had soaked into the soil. Even the birds avoided the place now. The crows that once circled his fields were gone. Marcus stepped out and began walking through the ruined section again. Each footstep sent up small clouds of gray dust that stung his throat. He crouched near a surviving patch of corn, one of the few still green. The leaves trembled faintly in the hot breeze, and he felt a pang of hope. But when he reached out to touch it, the plant's stem snapped off easily, hollow inside. He let it drop. The poison had gone deeper than he thought. The dog came running from the yard, barking once before stopping short at the edge of the field. The animal sniffed the air, whimpered, and backed away, tail tucked between its legs. Marcus watched it retreat and felt the chill of confirmation. Even animals could sense that the ground here was wrong. He spent the next few hours trying to clear the worst of it. Using his shovel, he dug out dead plants, piling them near the road to burn later. The air shimmered with heat and chemical vapor, and each breath burned his lungs. He worked without thinking, driven by instinct and desperation. By the time the sun began to sink, the pile of dead stalks stood taller than he did. He lit the fire carefully, striking a match and stepping back as the dry plants caught instantly. Thick, black smoke rose, curling into the red sky. It carried the same bitter smell that had haunted him for days, only stronger now, more concentrated. He covered his mouth with his sleeve, watching the flames devour what was left of his work. The sound of crackling stalks reminded him of rain, but instead of cleansing, it only spread more of that choking, heavy scent across his land. When the fire burned down to embers, he turned back toward the house. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. As he passed the tractor, he noticed the tires were streaked with a faint gray residue, the same as the soil. It hit him then. Hard and cold, the poison had spread wherever he had driven yesterday. Even his tools were tainted. He sat on the porch steps, staring at the horizon where the sun had vanished behind the trees. A deep orange afterglow bathed the fields, turning the dead stalks into shadows. Somewhere beyond those trees lay his neighbor's property, Richard Brown's land. The thought came uninvited, yet it stuck. Brown had always been ambitious, the kind of man who talked too loud and smiled too wide when the bank manager came around. Last spring, he'd offered to buy Marcus's southern plot, the one near the creek. Marcus had refused, of course. The offer had been far too low, and besides, he wasn't going to sell what his father had built. Brown hadn't taken the rejection well. He'd smiled that same practiced smile and said, "You'll come around when the time's right." Now, thinking of that conversation, Marcus felt a slow burn in his chest. Could it be? Would Brown go this far, to ruin another man's land, to poison his soil, just to buy him out? The idea seemed insane, but so did everything else that had happened in the past few days. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the sting of smoke, and whispered to himself that he'd find out the truth. That night, he couldn't sleep. The house creaked in the darkness, and the smell of burnt crops still hung faintly in the air. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every detail of the last few days. The way the sphere had glinted in the light, the trail of death it had left, the itching in his hands. Around midnight, he got up and went outside. The air was cool now, but the field looked like a graveyard. In the moonlight, the soil gleamed faintly, reflecting silver under the stars. He walked to the edge of the field, to the place where the slope led down toward the trees. The ball was still there, resting exactly where he had left it, silent and motionless. He half expected it to have vanished, but it hadn't. The weeds around it were gone now, burned away, leaving only a ring of bare ground. For a long time he just stood there, staring at it, feeling the weight of the night press down on him. Something shifted inside him then, a mixture of fear and determination. Whatever this was, he wasn't going to let it consume everything he had. He would fight it, even if no one else believed him. Tomorrow he would go to his neighbors again, ask questions, show them what had happened. Maybe someone had seen a truck, headlights, anything. There had to be a trace of whoever had done this. He turned back toward the house, his boots crunching on the brittle ground. Behind him, the sphere caught the moonlight once more, glowing faintly like an ember buried in ash. He didn't see it, but as he walked away, a faint wisp of smoke, or maybe vapor, rose from a crack along its surface, curling upward before disappearing into the night. Inside the house, Marcus washed his hands again, though they were already raw. The burning had grown worse, spreading to his wrists. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his reflection in the dark window. He looked older than he remembered, His face drawn tight, the lines around his eyes deepened. The man who stared back at him looked tired, yes, but not defeated. As dawn crept closer, the first birds began to call from the woods, though fewer than before. Marcus looked out at the land that had raised him, the land that now seemed to be dying under his feet, and he made himself a promise. This wasn't the end. He would get to the bottom of it, no matter how deep he had to dig. The world outside was changing, poisoned by something unseen. But Marcus Green had spent his life fighting the earth itself, floods, droughts, storms, and this would be no different. He didn't yet know how far the poison had spread, or that it had already begun to creep beyond his fence line. All he knew was that the land was sick, and someone had made it that way. And whoever they were, they would have to face him. The next few days unfolded beneath a relentless sun that seemed determined to bleach every trace of color from the earth. The air over the farm shimmered with heat, thick with the sour scent of decay and chemicals. Marcus hardly slept anymore. Each morning he woke before dawn, heart pounding, half expecting to find the entire field turned to dust. Each morning he stepped outside and saw that the damage had crept a little farther, inch by inch, like a slow-moving infection eating through his land. The poison hadn't stopped at the corn. It was spreading into the smaller patch where he grew beans and squash, reaching the edge of the irrigation ditch. The soil there, too, had gone dark. Even the grass by the fence line had begun to wither. He called the agricultural office again, but the woman on the phone spoke in the same tired tone as before. The report was under review, she said. Someone from the county would visit soon. But when soon came, it was not with help. 3 days later, 2 trucks rolled down the dirt road, stopping at the edge of Marcus's property. Men in collared shirts stepped out, their boots too clean, their hands empty of tools. They flashed badges and introduced themselves as inspectors from the Department of Environmental Quality. Their words were polite, rehearsed, and distant. Marcus walked them through the field, explaining what had happened from the beginning. The strange sphere, the smell, the dead plants, the lab results. The men listened, nodding, but their expressions didn't change. One of them bent down, scooped a bit of soil into a small plastic vial, and said it would be sent for testing. Another took photos of the field with a digital camera, murmuring something about potential contamination protocols. When Marcus tried to show them the printed lab report he already had, they glanced at it briefly and handed it back. By noon they were gone, leaving behind only the faint tire marks of their trucks and a vague promise to follow up. Marcus stood by the fence long after the dust from their departure had settled. Deep down, he knew what that visit had meant. It hadn't been an investigation, it had been a formality. They would file their reports, write a few lines, and forget about him. The following morning, another visitor arrived, this time from the bank. A man in a pressed gray suit stepped out of a sleek sedan and greeted Marcus with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had come to discuss the matter of outstanding payments. The farm loan had been due for renewal in a few weeks, but given the current state of the property, the bank had concerns about collateral. The man's words were smooth but heavy with meaning. If Marcus couldn't stabilize his yield, they might have to reassess his financial position. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He told the man he just needed time, that the land would recover. The man smiled again, polite and final, and handed him a brochure for asset liquidation options. When he left, Marcus tore the paper in half and threw it into the dirt. That evening, he sat on the porch watching the light fade over his ruined field. The quiet felt hostile. The frogs that usually croaked by the creek were gone. The birds had stopped nesting in the barn rafters. The world had grown still around him, and in that stillness his thoughts turned again to Richard Brown. The man's name had been echoing in his mind for days now, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Brown's land bordered his on the east side, just beyond the line of trees. His fields were thriving, green, lush, alive. From where Marcus sat, he could almost see them glowing in the fading sunlight. He remembered the day Brown had come by last spring. The man had driven up in a new truck, smiling wide, talking too fast. He'd leaned against the fence and offered to buy Marcus's southern acreage, the section near the water table. Said he wanted to expand his operations and help out an old friend. Marcus had refused without hesitation. His father's ashes were buried under that soil. No amount of money could buy that. Brown hadn't argued. He had just smiled tighter and said, "You'll change your mind when the season turns." The words had sounded harmless then. Now they sounded like a promise. The next morning, Marcus drove into town again. He stopped by the feed store first, where a few of the local farmers gathered most mornings to trade gossip and complain about prices. When he walked in, conversation faltered for a moment. Heads turned, then turned away. He could feel the shift, the quiet avoidance that spread when a man carried bad luck. He bought a bag of seed he didn't really need and listened. They were talking about him. Not by name, but he could hear it in the half-sentences and the sideways glances. Someone said the county might condemn his field if the contamination spread. Another mentioned improper chemical handling. By the time he reached the counter, the clerk barely met his eyes. Back outside, the sun was blinding. He sat in his truck for a while, gripping the steering wheel, letting the heat press against him. He had never felt more alone. The poison on his land was killing more than crops. It was stripping away his reputation, his place among people who once nodded to him in respect. That afternoon, as he drove home, he saw movement at the edge of his property. A truck, white, unfamiliar, was parked near the tree line where his land met Brown's. Two figures stood beside it, one of them holding something long and metallic, glinting in the sun. Marcus slowed the truck and watched. The men appeared to be unloading drums or containers, rolling them into the grass. When they noticed his vehicle on the road, they froze. One of them raised a hand briefly, a casual wave that carried no warmth. Marcus stared for a moment longer before driving on. By the time he reached the house, the sight had set his nerves on fire. He felt sure now that what had happened to his field wasn't some accident. He wanted to confront Brown immediately, but he forced himself to wait. Anger could be dangerous if it went off too soon. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, scribbling down everything he'd seen: the date, the time, the color of the truck, the shape of the barrels. He would gather proof this time, something no one could ignore. When darkness fell, he stood at the window and looked across the field toward the trees. A faint light flickered there, low and distant. Headlights, maybe, or lanterns. He went outside, walking carefully across the brittle ground, stopping now and then to listen. The night was warm, filled with the low hum of insects returning to the edges of the poisoned soil. Somewhere beyond the woods, an engine started, then cut off. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. The next morning, he found new tire tracks by the eastern fence. The soil was churned up, deep ruts pressed into the ground where heavy vehicles had passed. He crouched beside them, tracing the pattern with his fingers. The tread was unfamiliar. industrial, not farm equipment. He followed the trail as far as the trees, where it vanished into Brown's property. Marcus straightened slowly, his jaw tightening. It was one thing to suspect, another to know. He felt something hard settle in his chest, a grim kind of clarity. Brown was behind this. He had to be. The man had wanted this land for years. He'd found a way to poison it, to drive Marcus out, and now he was finishing the job. Later that day, he drove to Brown's farm. The gate stood open, the white house gleaming in the sun like it had been painted yesterday. Brown was outside, talking to a pair of workers near the barn. When he saw Marcus's truck pull up, his expression barely changed. He wiped his hands on a rag, smiling faintly, and strolled over. "Morning," he called, as if nothing were wrong. Marcus didn't return the greeting. He stepped out of the truck and looked around. The air here smelled clean, no trace of the acrid scent that haunted his own fields. The crops behind the house were green and thick, their leaves fluttering softly in the breeze. It was like another world. "I need to ask you something," Marcus said, his voice low. "Have you seen any trucks on my side of the property lately?" Brown raised an eyebrow, still smiling. "Trucks? Can't say I have. Why?" "Someone's been dumping something on my land. Poison. Killed half my crop already." The other man's smile faltered just slightly before returning, thinner now. "That's a shame," he said. "But you know how soil diseases are these days. Travel fast. One bad season and it's all downhill." Marcus stared at him, searching his face for any flicker of guilt. Brown's eyes were steady, calm, and calculating. He wasn't going to admit anything. "If you see anything at all, you'll let me know," Marcus said. "Of course," Brown replied smoothly, already turning back toward his barn. "We farmers have to look out for each other." Marcus stood there for another few seconds, the heat pressing against his skin, before climbing back into his truck. He drove away slowly, but every muscle in his body trembled with rage. He knew Brown was lying. He could feel it in his gut, the same way he could feel the sickness in his land. But without proof, no one would believe him. Not the county, not the bank, not even the neighbors who had once trusted his word. That night, the wind rose. Clouds gathered in the distance, promising rain, though none would come. Marcus sat on the porch long after dark, the notebook open on his lap, staring out across the dead field. Lightning flickered far off over the hills, and for a moment the world flashed white, revealing every scar of the poisoned soil. He thought of his father again, of the man's weathered hands, the way he used to stand in the same spot and say, "A man's land is his backbone. You break that, you break him." Marcus wasn't broken, not yet, but he was close. Something had to give, and soon. As the thunder rolled low across the horizon, he made up his mind. Tomorrow, he would start collecting more than notes and photographs. He would find the truth, even if it meant walking straight into the lion's den. The storm never came that night. The clouds gathered and rumbled and flashed at the horizon, but the rain stayed away, leaving only the heavy, dry air that pressed down on the earth. Marcus sat awake long after midnight, listening to the empty sounds of the night. The creak of the house, the whisper of the wind moving through brittle stalks of dead corn. His body was exhausted, but his mind would not rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the tracks in the dirt, the gray barrels by the tree line, the easy smile on Brown's face. He had faced droughts, blight, wildfires, and loss before, but never something like this. Something that had a human mind behind it. When morning came, it brought no relief. The sun was already high when Marcus stepped outside. The light was sharp, the air still. He walked through what remained of his field, and the sight hit him harder than it ever had before. The ground looked like a battlefield, charred, colorless, lifeless. The soil had turned to a dull gray powder that lifted with every step. The few green stalks that had survived the previous days now hung limp, their roots clawing at poisoned ground. He stopped beside the burnt pile of dead crops. Only ash remained, scattered by the wind, disappearing into the earth that had betrayed him. His boots sank slightly into the soft ground, and he realized with a jolt that the soil beneath was no longer moist but strangely slick, almost oily. He bent down and touched it, rubbing the dirt between his fingers. A faint shimmer caught the light, the same unnatural glint he had seen before. The poison was spreading. It was in the air, the water, the ground beneath his feet. Marcus felt a strange heaviness in his chest as he looked out over his land. For the first time, the silence felt permanent, as if nature itself had turned away from him. Even the insects had gone. He stood there for a long time until the heat became unbearable, then walked slowly back toward the house. Inside, the kitchen was dim and hot. The clock ticked softly, each second stretching into the next. He poured himself a glass of water and stared out the window, his reflection wavering in the glass pane. He barely recognized himself anymore. The man looking back at him had hollow eyes and hands covered in small red cracks that refused to heal. The itching that had started days ago had turned into a constant, burning irritation that no lotion could soothe. He tried not to think about it, but the thought kept returning. Whatever had poisoned his land was inside him now, too. He spent the day repairing what he could. The irrigation pump had broken during the last storm, and though it hardly mattered now, he forced himself to fix it anyway. Routine was all he had left. Work meant focus, and focus meant silence. He moved through the hours like a machine, tightening bolts, hammering loose boards, stacking what little remained of his tools in the shed. But no matter how hard he worked, he could not escape the smell. It clung to everything, the air, his clothes, his skin. It was a mix of metal and decay, impossible to wash away. As evening came, he sat on the porch and watched the sunset burn behind the trees. He could see Brown's land in the distance, untouched, shimmering gold in the light. The sight filled him with a slow, pulsing anger that felt like heat in his veins. He wanted to march across that field and demand justice, to force the man to admit what he had done. But what would that change? There were no witnesses, no proof, just dead crops and whispers in town that blamed Marcus himself for his misfortune. He had heard the rumors. People said he had been careless with his chemicals, that he had tried to save money using cheap pesticides. Others said he had been too proud to ask for help. The truth didn't matter anymore. Once gossip took root, it spread faster than any poison. Even the mailman no longer stopped for small talk. When Marcus waved from the porch, the man only nodded stiffly and drove off. That night, he couldn't eat. The hunger that had driven him for years, the hunger to build, to preserve, to endure, had turned into something else, something darker. He went to the shed and opened the old toolbox his father had left him. Inside were the same tools he'd used as a boy, a rusted wrench, a few nails, a hammer. He lifted the hammer and held it in his hand for a long time. The weight felt good, real, solid. For a moment, he imagined himself walking to Brown's house and smashing down the front door, forcing the truth out of him. He pictured the look of surprise, of fear. The image burned in his mind like a match, but then he set the hammer down. That wasn't the way. He leaned against the workbench and looked at the shelves. Jars of preserved vegetables lined the wall, each labeled in his late wife's handwriting. Her touch was still here, even after so many years. She had always been the one to calm his temper, to remind him that patience could outlast anger. He closed his eyes and breathed slowly, letting the memory cool the rage. When he opened them again, the plan had already begun to form. If no one believed him, he would make them believe. He would gather proof, photographs, samples, evidence. He would document every inch of this place until the truth could no longer be ignored. Over the next few days, Marcus moved through his land like a man possessed. He took pictures of the dying soil, of the tire tracks, of the strange sheen that shimmered where the poison was thickest. He filled glass jars with dirt and labeled each one with the date and location. He even climbed the old oak by the fence and set up a small trail camera that had once been used for watching deer. If anyone came near his property again, he would have their faces. The work gave him purpose, but it didn't stop the fear that crept into his thoughts late at night. Each time the wind rose, he thought he heard movement beyond the trees, the distant rumble of an engine, the faint metallic clatter of something rolling. Once, near midnight, he stepped outside with a flashlight and swept the beam across the field. For a second, he thought he saw a reflection in the distance, like light glinting off metal. But when he walked closer, there was nothing there. Only the lifeless soil stretching endlessly into the dark. Days blurred together. He stopped answering calls from the county office. He didn't want to hear more excuses or empty reassurances. His focus narrowed to the boundaries of his land, the dying crops, the endless silence. His body grew weaker, his hands more blistered, his eyes sunken, but his will hardened. He had nothing left to lose except the truth. One morning, he found the mailbox open and a folded note inside. It wasn't from the bank or the county. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was short. "You're not the first." Marcus stared at it, his pulse quickening. There was no signature, no address, no hint of who had written it. He turned the paper over and over, as if meaning might be hidden in the creases. The words haunted him all day. He thought about driving into town, asking questions, but something held him back. Whoever had left that note had done so quietly, carefully. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they knew more than he did. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, Marcus walked the length of his property one more time. The trail camera's light blinked faintly in the dusk. The wind carried a whisper of dry leaves, but no other sound. When he reached the eastern fence, he stopped. On the other side, Brown's field glowed green and perfect under the fading light, as if mocking him. The contrast between them, the living and the dead, cut deep. He clenched his fists until his palms burned. He didn't know when the moment came, only that it did. Standing there, surrounded by silence and ruin, Marcus felt something inside him harden into resolve. He wasn't going to plead anymore. He wasn't going to wait for help that would never come. If justice wouldn't find him, he would make his own. That night, the moon rose full and bright, casting silver over the poisoned land. Marcus went to the shed and opened the heavy drawer at the back, pulling out a roll of thick plastic and a pair of gloves. The air smelled of rust and dust. He moved quietly, deliberately, as if following instructions whispered from some distant place. By the time he stepped outside again, the moon was high above the fields and his shadow stretched long across the ground. He walked toward the trees, toward the place where Brown's land began, his mind clear for the first time in weeks. The anger was no longer wild or frantic. It had settled into something calm, sharp, and cold. Whatever had been done to him would be returned. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he knew where it would begin. As he crossed the field, the soil crunched under his boots, dry and lifeless. The smell of chemicals hung faintly in the air, but he barely noticed it anymore. The line between right and wrong had blurred into something simple: survival. He reached the fence, climbed over it, and stood on the edge of Brown's property, looking out across the thriving crops. They swayed gently in the night breeze, unaware of the man watching them from the shadows. Marcus stayed there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the leaves. Then he turned and walked back to his house, his decision already made. The next day would bring retribution. The morning after Marcus made his decision was heavy with silence. The air was thick and unmoving, and the sunlight filtered through a thin haze that gave everything a pale, metallic sheen. It was the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Marcus rose before dawn, as he always did, but this time his movements were deliberate in a way they hadn't been before. There was no rush, no wasted motion, just the quiet precision of a man who had accepted what had to be done. He brewed his coffee, though he barely drank it, and sat for a few minutes at the table looking out across the dead field. The land that had once been his pride now lay like a graveyard, still and gray. But beyond it, across the line of trees, Brown's fields glowed green and alive under the rising sun, an insult Marcus could no longer bear. He spent the first hours of daylight preparing. The gloves were already in the shed, and beside them the heavy-duty plastic bags he had found the night before. He gathered his camera, his notebook, and a small metal container that he filled with samples of the poisoned soil, his last pieces of evidence. Each jar was labeled with dates, coordinates, and descriptions. He lined them up on the workbench, taking photographs of each one. Proof. When the time came, he would make sure no one could deny what had been done to him. By mid-morning, he was standing at the edge of his property, staring at the narrow dirt road that divided his dying land from Brown's prosperity. He could hear the faint whir of machinery from the distance: tractors, sprinklers, the ordinary sounds of a farm that thrived. They were the sounds he used to take comfort in, the rhythm of a life he loved. Now they grated against him, reminders of what had been stolen. He waited until the sun had climbed higher before crossing the line of trees. The path was familiar. He had walked it many times before in better days when the two farms shared equipment or helped each other during harvests. Those times felt impossibly distant now. The underbrush was dry, cracking under his boots, and the air was thick with the smell of fertilizer and diesel. When he stepped out from the shade, the contrast hit him like a blow. The soil here was rich, dark, full of life. The corn stood taller, the leaves broader, the green so vibrant it almost hurt his eyes. Marcus crouched near the first row and examined the ground. It looked too perfect. There was something unnatural about the way the plants grew, almost uniform, their stems thick and glossy. He dug his fingers into the soil and felt a faint tackiness, a residue that clung to his skin. The smell was faint but familiar, the same acrid scent that had haunted his own land. His heart began to pound. This was it. The proof. Brown hadn't just poisoned him, he had been feeding his own fields with something else, something illegal, something powerful enough to make the earth bloom like this while destroying everything around it. He pulled the camera from his bag and began taking photos one after another, documenting the soil, the roots, the faint shimmer of chemical residue. Each click of the shutter steadied his hands, feeding the fire inside him. When he was done, he sealed a small sample of the soil in a jar and marked it carefully. Then he moved closer to the house. The barn door was open, and voices carried through the still air. Marcus stopped, keeping to the shadows. 2 men were inside, one of them unmistakably brown, the other younger, with the look of a hired hand. They were talking about shipments, about barrels and schedules. Marcus listened, his stomach tightening as he caught fragments of their conversation. "The last batch went through the creek line," the younger man said. "No one saw a thing." Brown laughed softly and replied, "They won't. By the time anyone figures it out, the runoff will be long gone." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. He understood now. The poison hadn't been dumped only on his land. It had been washed through the creek that ran between their properties, carried straight into his soil. A deliberate act disguised as coincidence. He took another photo, zooming in on the barrels stacked by the barn wall, each marked with faded industrial labels. He didn't realize the noise he made until both men turned sharply toward the doorway. "Who's there?" Brown barked. Marcus stepped out before he could talk himself out of it. The look on Brown's face was almost worth the risk. Shock flickering into something harder, more dangerous. "You," Brown said, taking a step forward. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" "I could ask you the same thing," Marcus said, his voice low but steady. "You think I wouldn't find out? You poisoned my land. You killed my crops. For what? So you could buy it cheap when I went under?" For a moment, Brown said nothing. His eyes flicked to the worker beside him, who shifted uneasily. Then he smiled, a thin, humorless curve of the mouth. "You're imagining things, Marcus. I've got nothing to do with your mess. Maybe you just can't handle your own chemicals anymore. Happens to old farmers all the time." Marcus held up the camera. "I have proof. Pictures, samples, everything. I heard you talking just now. You did this." The younger man swore under his breath, but Brown didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward, his tone dropping. "You think anyone's going to believe you? You've been ranting for weeks. They already think you're losing your mind. And if you come near my land again, I'll call the sheriff myself. Trespassing's still a crime, even for desperate men." Marcus stood his ground, though his pulse was hammering. "You won't get away with it." "Go home," Brown said quietly, almost kindly, "before you make this worse for yourself." Marcus turned and walked away, forcing himself not to look back. His hands were shaking as he crossed the line of trees again, but not from fear. Rage burned through him, pure and cold. Brown was right about one thing. The county wouldn't believe him. They never did, but he didn't need their belief anymore. He had the truth, and now he needed the world to see it. That afternoon, he drove to the nearest town with his camera, his notebook, and the jars of soil packed in a box beside him. He went straight to the office of a small local paper whose editor he'd met once years ago at a community fair. Her name was Clara. He found her hunched over her desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and the stale smell of coffee. At first, she didn't recognize him. When he told her his name, she blinked, searching her memory, and then smiled politely. "What can I do for you, Mr. Green?" He told her everything. The words came out rough, uneven, like stones being dragged from a well. He described the sphere, the dying fields, the poison, the inspectors who did nothing, the trucks, the tracks, the barrels, the confrontation. He laid the photos and samples out on her desk, one by one, until the small space was covered with evidence. For a long time, she didn't say anything. She looked at the pictures, then at Marcus, then back at the pictures again. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but sharp. "If this is true, it's not just about your farm. This could be criminal." "It is," Marcus said, "and no one will stop it unless someone tells the truth." She nodded slowly. "Then let's tell it." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt something shift inside him, a faint flicker of hope. Clara promised to run the story after verifying the samples. She called a contact in the State Environmental Agency and arranged to have independent tests done. Marcus left her office with the feeling that, at last, the tide had turned. Over the next few days, everything moved quickly. The tests confirmed what Marcus had already known. The soil on his land contained a deadly concentration of illegal pesticides and industrial waste. The same compounds were found in trace amounts near Brown's property and in the barrels stacked by his barn. When Clara's article was published, it spread faster than anyone expected. "Local farmers' land poisoned by illegal dumping," the headline read. Beneath it, a photograph of Marcus standing beside his ruined field, the dead crops stretching behind him like a scar. The reaction was immediate. Reporters arrived from nearby towns, their vans clogging the small roads. Environmental groups demanded an investigation. County officials, embarrassed and cornered, announced a hearing. For the first time, Marcus wasn't alone. People who had once turned away from him now came to his door, some offering help, others just to apologize. As for Brown, his confidence began to crack. His workers were questioned, and one of them, perhaps the same man Marcus had overheard, eventually confessed. The barrels had come from a chemical plant 2 counties over. They had been paid to dispose of the waste quietly, and Brown had taken the job to save money. The poison that had destroyed Marcus's land had been a part of that deal. When Marcus heard the news, he felt no triumph, only a deep, tired relief. Justice, when it came, was slow but certain. Brown's farm was seized by the state, his assets frozen, and charges filed. The man himself left town before the trial, vanishing somewhere down south, leaving behind only rumors. In the weeks that followed, Marcus's land remained silent, but the silence no longer felt like defeat. The community that had once shunned him came together to help him rebuild. Volunteers arrived with new equipment, seeds, and fresh soil to begin the long process of cleansing the earth. Clara's story won an award, though she always said it belonged to Marcus. On the morning the new crops were planted, Marcus stood alone at the edge of the field, watching the tractors move across the horizon. The air was cleaner now, the smell of death replaced by the faint scent of fresh-turned earth. He closed his eyes for a moment and listened, to the wind, to the creak of the trees, to the heartbeat of his land returning. It would take years to heal, but it would live again. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. The truth had cost him almost everything, but it had given him something back too, a sense of purpose, a belief that even one man's voice could still matter in a world that too often looked the other way. As the sun climbed higher, painting the fields in gold, Marcus picked up a handful of clean soil and let it fall through his fingers. It was cool and dry, untainted, and for the first time it felt like home again. Months passed, and the seasons turned slowly, as if time itself had decided to move more gently over the wounded land. The winter rains came first, washing through the fields, carrying with them the last traces of poison from the soil. Marcus watched from the porch each morning as the water pooled and shimmered in the furrows, glinting with the light of a pale sun. The air was cold but clean, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the farm smelled of rain and earth again instead of chemicals. The scent brought back old memories of mornings long ago when he and his father had walked this same land in silence, their boots sinking into the mud as they checked the crops together. That memory, once a source of pain, began to feel like comfort now, something that still tied him to what was good and pure in the world. After the article and the investigation, his life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. The world beyond the county had taken an interest in his story, and for a while the farm became a place people came to see, as though it were a symbol of something larger than itself, a victory for the small man, a reminder that truth could still rise from the dirt. Journalists had come, cameras flashing, their questions endless. At first, Marcus had endured it with quiet patience, but the noise and attention wore on him. He wasn't used to being a symbol. He was a farmer, nothing more. When the excitement died down and the world's attention shifted elsewhere, he was grateful. He wanted only the quiet again. He wanted the sound of the wind, the whisper of growing things, the solitude that had always been his truest companion. The land was healing, though slowly. Environmental specialists came and went, taking samples, testing the groundwater, charting the progress. They spoke in careful terms: partial recovery, sustainable restoration, contaminant stabilization, phrases that meant little to Marcus but sounded like hope. Volunteers helped him plant new trees along the edges of the property, a mixture of oaks and maples that would one day grow into a small grove. It wasn't farmland anymore, not in the way it had been, but that no longer bothered him. This was something different now, something meant to last longer than a single season. He spent his mornings tending the young saplings, checking the soil around their roots, talking softly to them the way his father once did to the crops. He didn't know if they could hear, but the ritual mattered. The rhythm of it gave his days shape and peace. The afternoons he devoted to repairing what the years had taken: the barn roof, the fences, the porch steps. He worked slowly, without hurry, his movements deliberate and sure. There was no longer the old urgency to produce, to meet quotas, to compete. Those pressures had died with the poisoned corn. What remained was the quiet satisfaction of rebuilding, of touching wood and soil with hands that still remembered how to create. Sometimes, when he walked the length of the field, he would stop at the low stretch of ground where the poison had first taken hold. Nothing grew there yet, only a thin layer of grass beginning to take root. But he didn't see it as a scar anymore. It was part of the story now, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. He had decided to mark the spot permanently. With the help of some local carpenters, he built a small sign from old oak boards and carved the words himself, carefully and slowly, each letter etched deep into the grain. This land once suffered, but it still remembers kindness. When the sign was finished, he planted it at the center of the grove, beneath the largest of the new trees. The day he placed it there, the sky was bright and clear. Clara was there too, the journalist who had written his story and, in a way, saved his farm. She came not with a notebook or a camera, but simply to visit. They stood together for a long time, watching the wind move through the young branches. "You've done something good here," she said quietly, "not just for yourself, for everyone who'll come after." Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes following the way the light filtered through the leaves. "It was never about revenge," he said. "I just wanted the truth to mean something again." She nodded, understanding, and after a while she left him alone with the trees. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Marcus sat on the porch, a mug of tea warming his hands. The shadows stretched long across the fields, but the land no longer looked empty. It was alive in a new way. Birds had returned, their songs faint but persistent. A pair of foxes had built a den near the creek, and deer sometimes came at dusk to graze near the grove. Even the soil, once gray and lifeless, had begun to darken again, rich and fertile. Life was returning, slowly, humbly, as if apologizing for its absence. He thought often of Brown in those quiet hours, though not with the bitterness he once had. The man's farm had been sold off in parts after the trial, his name now spoken only in whispers. Marcus wondered sometimes if Brown thought about what he had done, if he regretted it, or if men like that were simply incapable of such thoughts. But the wondering never lasted long. The past had done enough damage. It didn't deserve any more of his life. One afternoon, months later, Marcus received a letter in the mail from the Environmental Agency. The soil, it said, had officially been declared safe again for cultivation. He read the words twice, then set the paper down and looked out the window at the grove. He could start planting crops again if he wanted. Corn, beans, whatever he chose. The land would yield again, they said. But as he thought about it, he realized he didn't want to return to the old way. The farm had given him enough of itself already. Now it was time to let it rest. Instead, he decided to turn the grove into a memorial, a sanctuary of sorts for farmers who had lost everything and needed a place to remember that even ruined ground could heal. He reached out to Clara, who helped him connect with a few organizations, and together they arranged for the land to be registered as a protected space. They called it the Green Foundation, though Marcus protested that his name didn't belong on it. Still, the others insisted, and in time he accepted it with a modest pride. The dedication ceremony was small. A handful of neighbors came along with the volunteers who had helped restore the land. They gathered beneath the young trees, their leaves whispering softly in the spring breeze. Marcus spoke briefly, his words simple and steady. "This land has seen the worst of what people can do," he said, "but it's also seen how we can make things right. It reminds us that no soil stays dead forever, not if we care enough to bring it back." When he finished, there was a moment of silence, broken only by the rustle of the branches. Then someone began to clap, and soon the sound spread through the grove like a heartbeat. After everyone left, Marcus remained alone beneath the trees. The air was warm, and the light of late afternoon painted everything in gold. He knelt by the small sign he had carved and traced the letters with his fingers, feeling the rough edges of the wood beneath his calloused skin. The wind moved gently through the branches, carrying the faint scent of blossoms from the nearby orchard. It was the smell of life beginning again. As the shadows lengthened, Marcus walked back toward the house, moving slowly, his steps steady and sure. The porch creaked under his weight as he sat down in his usual chair. He looked out over the land, over the trees and the faint shimmer of the creek beyond, and felt a quiet peace settle in his chest. The farm had taken everything from him once, his strength, his hope, nearly his faith in humanity. But it had also given back something deeper. He had learned that even in the face of betrayal and ruin, decency could endure. That truth, once unearthed, had a life of its own. The last light of the day glowed on the horizon, soft and amber, stretching across the grove like a promise. Marcus watched until the stars began to appear, one by one, their reflections trembling faintly in the water of the creek. somewhere far off, an owl called, its voice deep and familiar. The night was cool, but he didn't feel its chill. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and let the sounds of his land, the wind, the water, the rustle of the trees, wrap around him like a lullaby. When he opened his eyes again, the moon had risen high, casting silver light across the field. The young trees gleamed in it, their leaves moving gently, as if waving to him. Marcus smiled softly. The land no longer asked anything of him. It was alive again, whole again, free. He had done his part, and that, he thought, was enough. If this story kept you watching till the end, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There's more unbelievable true stories coming your way. Share this video with your friends and check out the next one. You won't believe what happens there.